For the past 6,000 years, the majority of human accomplishments have been happening in cities and other permanent settlements. And since 2010, for the first time in human history, a majority of the world's population lives in urban areas. Cities rise, cities fall. Some retain a glimmer of the glory of their past, while others crumble into rubble and get forgotten. The following is a list of the cities that I believe have become the most important in human history. First on the list is Uruk, located in what is now Iraq. Iraq is not a major power player today, and many consider it to be teetering on becoming a failed state. However, the land of Iraq is associated with the birthplace of civilization, starting with ancient Sumeria. They produced the first writing system, as well as timekeeping system, of 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour that we use today. Settling along the Euphrates River in the Fertile Crescent, it, like other Sumerian cities, benefited from fresh water and rich soil, which produced enough crops to feed a large population, and then allow other humans to diversify their labor into other realms like smithing, forestry, carpentry, baking, cooking, writing, worship, and even sex work. While not the only major Sumerian city, it is arguably the most famous due to the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest remaining written stories in human history. Memphis is next on the list, and no, I'm not talking about Memphis, Tennessee. I'm sure it's great for blues music and getting robbed at gunpoint, but Memphis, Tennessee is not quite as historically important as Memphis in Egypt. The three most important cities of ancient Egypt were Memphis, Luxor, and Thebes. While Luxor probably has the most impressive monuments and Thebes was the center of Upper Egypt, Memphis was the first capital of a unified Upper and Lower Egypt, and was a center of power during ancient Egypt's most impressive archaeological and architectural accomplishments during much of the Old Kingdom. While power eventually shifted towards Thebes and then Alexandria and then eventually Cairo, Memphis's legacy still lives on today. Plus, Memphis, Tennessee has its own pyramid, and while it's not quite as cool as the ones in Luxor, let alone even the one in Las Vegas, it does have a Bass Pro Shop. Eventually, the power of the Sumerian city-states would wane and would be replaced by the Akkadians and the Babylonians. This city was the center of two major empires, the Old and New Babylonian empires, because historians are unimaginative with the way that they name things. This city was the home of Hammurabi's Code of Laws, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, and other great accomplishments. The Neo-Babylonian Empire also conquered ancient Judea and forced the elite Jews into exile, where they eventually developed monotheism. The city has also inspired just about every genius from ancient Greek historian Herodotus to Bob Marley. Next on the list is Persepolis. Again, my pronunciation is terrible, look it up yourself. Persepolis was sort of kind of the capital of the Achaemenid dynasty in Persia, the first great Persian empire and quite possibly the most famous, known for, in sharp contrast to many previous empires, to be fairly benign to its conquered peoples, supporting religious tolerance and a Pony Express system. However, it is worth noting that this city, by and large, was probably more ceremonial than functional. And many of the more important decisions were probably outside of the city, but nonetheless, since it symbolized the first multicultural, gigantic empire in human history, I think it deserves a spot on this list. Tyre is next on the list, a Phoenician port city in what is now Lebanon, famed for its purple dyes and, more importantly, setting up the foundations for maritime colonization, including the city of Carthage. It also spread the Phoenician alphabet, which the Greeks adopted, modified, and then spread elsewhere. Most European languages are based off of the Phoenician alphabet. Or more accurately, their writing system is. To the south of Tyre lived Jerusalem, the capital of ancient Judea, being the holiest city in Judaism, arguably the holiest in Christianity and the third holiest in Islam. Judea was conquered by Babylon, which in turn was conquered by the Persians, who allowed the elite Jews to return to Jerusalem, where they developed their monotheistic religion. They would eventually be taken over by the Greeks, have a brief period of independence, and then get taken over by the Romans, then the Byzantines, the Arabs, Turks, Crusaders, more Muslim empires, and eventually the British, before the modern state of Israel and the Palestinian territories, both of which claim parts of the city. The city was also the most besieged in history. Another city virtually everyone with access to basic education has heard of is Athens, centered around an acropolis. This city, which started out as a place to grow grapes and olives, would eventually turn into the birthplace of democracy, Greek philosophy, and the golden age of, well, Athens, unsurprisingly. However, it lost the Peloponnesian Wars to Sparta, and eventually saw its power fade away, as the Macedonians and later Romans and then Turks dominated the scene. Nonetheless, the glory of its past still resulted in it becoming the capital of modern-day Greece today. Alexandria. Alexander the Great loved naming places after himself. And while most of these cities have been forgotten, the same is not true for Alexandria in northern Egypt. This would become home to one of the greatest centers of Greek knowledge in subjects such as geometry, geology, and cartography, centered around the Library of Alexandria. Today, it is the second largest city in Egypt after Cairo. Then we go to Rome. There is so much to talk about the city, they don't really even know where to begin. According to the myth, it was founded by Romulus and Remus, who are the descendants of the Trojan War refugees, and for some reason were saved and suckled by a wolf. Romulus killed Remus and invited a bunch of criminals to his settlement, along with some graping of Sabian women founded the city of Rome, along Palatine Hill. There's an element of truth to this story. Well, actually, I don't know if there really is, but what is kind of true is that Greek civilization, due to their colonies, had heavily influenced the Latin tribe, who had also been influenced by the Etruscan people, who eventually formed into a sort of proto-Latin, proto-Roman culture that set up the foundation of what would be arguably the most influential city in history. And yes, it is true that the city was eventually sacked, ending the Western Roman Empire. It still has remained the head of the Catholic Church, and is the capital of the modern nation-state of Italy. As strange as it sounds, Rome would not always be the center of Rome, as the Roman general Constantine converted to Christianity, making it the official religion of the empire, and setting up shop at a strait between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. While the empire split in two, the eastern half would prosper and the western half collapsed and decayed. This city would become the capital of the Byzantines for roughly a millennia, but was eventually conquered by the Ottoman Turks and is now the largest city in Turkey and spans 2 continents. Next on the list is a duo, Mecca and Medina, in what is now Saudi Arabia. Muhammad would found the religion of Islam in Mecca, but due to clashes with polytheists fled to Medina, where he regrouped and reorganized and gained a larger army. He would take over Mecca by making it the holiest city in Islam, and Medina would become the second holiest city. While many of the political, economic, military, and cultural capitals of Islamic civilization would move to cities like Damascus, Baghdad, and today Riyadh, nonetheless, these 2 cities remained as the religious capitals. Next on the list is Baghdad. Baghdad gets a bad rap today for obvious reasons, but it was once one of the greatest cities in the world, home to the Abbasid Caliphate during the Islamic Golden Age, and home to the House of Wisdom. At this point in civilization, it had returned to its birthplace in what is now Iraq. But this time it was the Arabs and their new religion of Islam that were the dominant force on the scene. That is until the Mongols sacked Baghdad, burned down the House of Wisdom, which eventually resulted in a long, painful decline in Islamic civilization that still continues to this day. Speaking of the Mongols, we have to get to Karakorum, which I'm again mispronouncing, the capital of the Mongol Empire. The Mongols were a nomadic steppe peoples that really didn't care for cities that much, a sentiment they showed when they burned other cities to the ground. Nonetheless, even their footprint of death and destruction on such a wide scale of land means that they kind of deserve a place on the list. I guess it's kind of like the way that the Dothraki city in Game of Thrones has a ton of influence, even though their main contribution was burning greater cities to the ground. But given the fact that it organized the culture that was burning cities to the ground, it still deserves a spot. Next on the list is Beijing, a city that again does not need an introduction. While not always the capital of Chinese civilization, it was the center of power for some of the earliest modern dynasties, such as the Ming and Qing. It lost its seat of power during the reign of Chinese nationalists, who centered their power in Nanjing. But when the communists eventually won a civil war in the aftermath of World War II, Beijing became the political center again, and today the center of the world's second largest economy, despite the fact that Shanghai is the most populous city. Kyoto and Edo are next on the list. Japanese history until the 19th century is largely an isolated affair, oftentimes with an emperor located in Quito rivaling the shogun located in Edo, which is now called Tokyo. Eventually, the military powers would gain more control, and their power balance would shift to Edo. Today, Tokyo has the largest economy of any city in the world, and, by some metrics, the largest city that has ever existed, not to mention a giant in finance, politics, tech, science, art, and culture, and just about pretty much everything else. Delhi. I have not given the Indian subcontinent the attention it deserves. There were pre-Indo-European peoples centered around the Indus River Valley, but we don't know that much about their civilization. Delhi's history really begins quite a lot later, after the Indo-European invasion and the Sanskrit epics. They oftentimes mention Delhi. I'm hesitant to make any sort of assertions about Delhi's very early history, namely because Indian history is fairly mysterious around this time compared to what we know about, say, the Middle East. But nonetheless, the Delhi Sultanate would rise up during the Middle Ages and ruled over what we now consider most of the Indian subcontinent. And in part a result of this legacy, it would eventually become the capital of the modern nation-state of India, despite Mumbai being larger. Florence was the center of the Renaissance. At the time, Western Europe was awakening from its slumber, and what better place to be at the epicenter of it than the Italian peninsula, which at the time was fractured into many city-states. Florence would emerge as a center of commerce through the power of the Medici banking family, along with political philosophers like Machiavelli. It would also be home to so much of Western civilization's most cherished art, namely that of Michelangelo. Venice would be another city at the center of Europe's rebirth on the Italian peninsula, built on literal sticks in a lagoon by people escaping Attila the Hun. The city would eventually grow and become one of the most important port cities in the world along the Adriatic, oftentimes rivaling the power of the Ottoman Empire. Rich noblemen would fund lower-class sailors on trade expeditions that would result in maritime trade connections across the Mediterranean and beyond, not only bringing in wealth for the elite, but also resulting in greater economic mobility for low-born people for a period of time. Eventually, its power would fade due to the power balance shifting more westward along the Atlantic during the Age of Exploration. Another maritime port would be Lisbon. Moving away from the Mediterranean, the Portuguese would become the first global superpower, setting up trading posts and colonies in the Azores, Cabo Verde, and much of Africa, India, Southeast Asia, Brazil, and other places. Lisbon was also the first center of globalization, and even set up European connections with Japan. However, the darker side to all the accomplishments and exploration is that Lisbon is where the first major decisions in regards to the transatlantic slave trade were made. Another Iberian power would emerge, Spain. This goes to the city of Seville. Spain had a fairly decentralized culture due to its linguistic diversity, but nonetheless, the city of Seville would eventually become the most influential in my opinion. First starting off as a Roman city, then taken over by Germanic barbarians and then the Muslims coming in from North Africa. It was eventually conquered by the Spanish, and under the Spanish Inquisition, the Jews and Muslims either had to be converted, exiled, or killed, solidifying Spain's Catholic culture. The city would become a major port and staging ground for contact and governance of the Spanish Empire in the Americas. Speaking of that empire, we have to go to Santo Domingo. You may have heard of this obscure figure by the name of Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus was from Genoa, but sailed under the Spanish crown, landing in the Bahamas, but would eventually set up the first permanently inhabited European settlement, Santo Domingo, on the island of Hispaniola in what is now the Dominican Republic. This city would be the jump-off point for other settlements in the Caribbean, then Central and South America. Speaking of the mainland, we have to talk about Tenochtitlan and later Mexico City. Pre-Columbian America has some pretty impressive cities in their own right, such as Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztecs, famed for its canals, architecture, and urban planning. When the Spanish landed, Montezuma, the last emperor of the Aztecs, thought that Cortez, the leader of the Spaniards, was a god. The combination of steel weapons, horses, artillery, and disease led to the destruction of the empire centered around the city. Modern Mexico City has been built on top of this capital, and today is one of the largest in the world. However, its urban planning and infrastructure are far less impressive by the standards of today's time than the Aztecs were for their time. Cusco was the cultural capital of the Incas and the largest city in South America. When the Spaniards led by Francisco Pizarro came along, this led to the destruction of the empire for similar reasons that we saw in the Aztecs. Despite being isolated, the city was the center of a vast empire and complex road system, with some of the finest masonry and architecture. Today it remains the center of Andean culture and a major tourist hub. Next on the list is Paris. This city is so famous that I don't even know if it's even worth mentioning. This place started out on the muddy shores of the Seine River by Celtic-speaking people groups. Little did those Celts know that they would emerge as the forefathers of one of the most powerful cities on the planet. It would not be very important during the Roman era, but eventually would become a major center of the Frankish power, which centralized control over much of Western and Central Europe. This is part of where the name France comes from, France, Franks. By the 1700s, it would become a center of the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and the Napoleonic era, as well as just an incredibly long list of political, economic, intellectual, and artistic achievements. Since the defeat of Germans during World War II, the city has faced peace and prosperity with the occasional riot and terrorist attack here and there. Another city with too much lore to cover is London. London started out as Londinium, a Roman town that the Romans didn't really care much for, and the Celts even burned down. Nonetheless, during the Middle Ages, the House of Wessex would coalesce power and kick out many of the Vikings, setting up the foundations of England. This would be until they were taken over by the Normans, who were the ancestors of Vikings, so I guess the Vikings kind of won. The city would eventually emerge as not only a political center, but also a commercial and cultural center, and eventually become the capital of the largest empire in human history. Moscow. Russia is a latecomer on the European historical scene, not even being a village at the time that Kiev was a bustling hub. However, one group of Slavic people named the Russians would rise up in the Duchy of Moscow to fight against the Mongols. The defeat of the Mongols would result in them becoming the standard bearers of Slavic and much of Orthodox Christian civilization. And while it is true that St. Petersburg would eventually be built and would take a lot of power away from Moscow for certain periods of time, particularly under Peter the Great, both the Soviet Union and the modern Russian Federation have Moscow as their capital. Speaking of capitals, we have to get to Vienna, the center of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Vienna would be the home to some of the most influential people in history, such as Mozart, Sigmund Freud, and a guy with a tiny mustache. The city today is the capital of Austria, and is famed for halting the Muslim invasion of the Ottoman Empire, a conquest that kept much of Europe still Christian. And while it is true that it has not been a major power player since the end of World War I, it still is a very influential city nonetheless. Berlin is more influential today. It's the capital of Germany, as most of you know, the fourth largest economy in the world, and de facto leader of mainland Europe. Germany is a latecomer on the world stage, as many German cities rival Berlin's influence, such as Frankfurt, a financial power, Munich, an industrial and cultural power, among others. Berlin, on the other hand, is a center of quite possibly the most important flashpoints of the 20th century, not only due to World War II, but also the Cold War. After the Berlin Wall fell, it symbolized the end of a bipolar world. Today, Germany has coalesced and still uses Berlin as its capital. New York City, a city again that needs no introduction, bought from the natives by the Dutch during the 1600s, along some of the best natural harbors in the world. Dutch values of commerce and tolerance still play a role in New York City's success. The Dutch aristocracy set up a foundation of powerful families like the Roosevelts. Eventually, the British would take over, and then get kicked out by the Americans after independence. The city has always been the largest in the country and one of the largest in the world, a center of finance, commerce, retail, fashion, art, architecture, engineering, and countless other endeavors. Ellis Island would be the port of entry for immigrants coming during the early 20th century, making it one of the most culturally diverse in the world, with Italians, African Americans, Irish, Puerto Ricans, Chinese, and other groups merging into an American melting pot. Key events in recent memory have been the Wall Street crash that started the Great Depression and later Great Recession in 1929 and 2008 respectively, along with 9/11. It is also the center of the UN headquarters and is the second wealthiest city in the world in terms of aggregate wealth after Tokyo. Washington, D.C., the capital of the US and the most important political center of the modern day for obvious reasons. Being built in the aftermath of the War of Independence, it incorporated neoclassical urban design and architecture in homage to the democratic and republican values of Athens and Rome. While the US was not a major power player at the time, by the turn of the 20th century it became a great power, and by World War II, a superpower, and in the aftermath of the USSR's collapse, the only remaining superpower, and thus the only remaining superpower capital. The White House, Congress, Supreme Court, Lincoln Memorial, Library of Congress, Pentagon, headquarters of numerous government bureaucracies, along with foreign embassies, are all located in this metropolitan area. And it also probably has the highest concentration of museums in the world. Iconic events such as Martin Luther King Jr.'s March on Washington also took place here, along with some of the most important decisions of the past century. Last on the list is Singapore, the last true functioning city-state. Singapore was once an obscure fishing island village, without a particularly long list of lore. Nonetheless, it was located partially along the Straits of Malacca, which is the quickest maritime choke point between the Indian and Pacific Ocean. This strait was widely used by various kingdoms and empires in the region. However, it also served as a major tradeway for European explorers, resulting in the Dutch, Portuguese, and British taking up colonies. The British would colonize Malaysia, which at the time would include the island of Singapore, which would become an important port of the British Empire, managing trade between India and Australia, Hong Kong, and other colonies in the Indo-Pacific. The Japanese would conquer the port of Singapore during World War II, stunning the British, who had a very high concentration of troops there. After World War II and the defeat of the Japanese, Malaysia would eventually gain independence from Britain, and Singapore would eventually gain independence from Malaysia. Under the leadership of Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore developed a unique system of governance that blended Asian authoritarianism and hierarchy and technocracy with Western rule of law and modern institutions. This has resulted in one of the wealthiest centers of finance, science, education, technology, and logistics in the world. And there's my list. You may have come to different conclusions than I did, and that's okay. While there are some ancient cities I mentioned that are still alive and kicking, there are plenty of others that were once great but are now ruins, and others, ones that are still inhabited but are some of the absolute worst places to live in the modern world. Take Baghdad or Damascus, for example. Learning about the rise and fall of great cities should open our minds to understanding not only the past, but how the cities we live in today will look like in the future. Will Washington, D.C. be abandoned and be a set of ruins 1,000 years from now? Will Berlin be a hellscape engulfed in civil war? Or maybe we'll just learn from our mistakes of the past and keep our current cities great. Only time will tell.